to all of you in the room as we do the heavy lift of work and as we tell our stories. So as a Navajo woman, I introduced myself and where I'm from. I also work hand in hand with my little sister, Jolene Holgate, who will help me with this presentation as a lot of her time and dedication has gone into the work. But as in where I stand and who I am, I bring my sticks and as a way to protect and to guide me through these very serious conversations that we will take part. As a Navajo woman, we are told early in life that there were monsters left in this world that will devour us. And monsters continue to stay in this world to remind us of our own humanity and our own humility. And so I carry these sticks as a weapon, as a protection, and to know that as long as I have them with me, we can, working together, can really combat these modern monster expectations. So I really wanted to ground the work that we do, and to state that all of the work that we'll talk about is done by volunteers. There's no federal money at this point available for the missing and murdered. And so with that, I wanted to go to the first video. Our IT people will help us. My daughter considers me a boomer, but I'm not ready to take on that title. But I just don't know how to put a link in my PowerPoint. So after this, I'm going to Google it. And she's 16, and I refer to her a lot because she keeps me humble in this world. And so I want to introduce Misty. She's not able to be here today, but she is the reason why we're here and the work that we do.
I always tell the families, be aware that you become the advocate, you also become the investigator. Nobody knows what is going on our reservation, not just the Navajo reservation, but nationwide. These cases are not taken seriously. They don't hit headline news. We ask where are these cases going, and we are told that they are being looked at, but are they? When I first started this, I realized that our people did not have a place to go to report our missing people. I decided to create a booklet. This includes all of our updated missing persons from 1956. A lot of them do get found, but there are some that's been in these booklets ever since I've made them. The goals of the group is spreading awareness and helping the families get their voices heard, because this is a silent epidemic, and trying to get people to listen to our voices and hear our cries is almost near impossible to do. The case that really meant a lot to me was Kaczynski Aerial Brigade. Hold on. We did marches, we did awareness stands, and we were going to do another awareness event for her, and that week is when we found out that they had found the remains of Ariel. Ariel was murdered. Even after her murder, her mom took it to the next level to find justice for Ariel. And just recently she just passed. So we will continue to seek justice for Ariel, because we know that was her mom, Jacqueline's wish. I have been part of the threat, so have the other four of our advocates. But these are the things that we have to face. I always tell the people that want to help me become a volunteer advocate, this is something that you have to be comfortable with. I've been scared for most of my life because I was told not to speak. But now I have a voice, and I'm not scared anymore. I'm not scared to speak. And I will do this for the people
not only is helping us on the ground in her volunteer work, but then seeing those relatives who continue to be missing. We know the stories, we met with the families, we've talked with the children who just want their dad to come home or their mother to come home. And Niski and others in my generation and before, we had always heard, don't talk about certain issues. We don't talk about things that are hurtful because you'll bring them upon yourself in a negative way. And so I want to say with this conversation, we have put our prayers and our words and our tears into that ceremonial way and have brought out our protection shields that brought us back from the long walk. And so in those prayers and in those ceremonies, we have been, with our words, have conveyed that our purpose here is the healing aspect of it, to bring justice. And just like any challenge or situation that you find in your homes, in your community, or your nation, our voice is being used as a way to protect our children and our community members, and then most importantly to do the prevention work. And so it's important for me to say that because the conversations require a lot of courage from the families who have been victim shamed, victim blamed, neglected, dehumanized. And so we're restoring not only them to trust us, but now combating with law enforcement to believe that this is actually happening. So in 2016, our nation had a tragic loss of a young, vibrant little girl named Ashlyn Light. She was playing in a ditch near her house, like so many of us who have played at home with her brother. And Ashlyn was kidnapped from her home. She was taken. She was brutally murdered, assaulted. And with that, with having her plucked so violently from us, as a community, as a nation, we all felt the vulnerability. And we felt the pain and the grief of first trying to find her, and then when we found her, working with the family to go through that pain of what they're experiencing. And so to support her family, we first heard her favorite color was yellow. So we came out as a community yellow. And we heard it was purple, and we came out purple. And then it was red, and we came out. And some people, well, for myself as a mother of 2 children, 2 daughters, I recognize that that's how my daughters grew and bloomed, and their life changed, and their colors changed, and what they liked in life changed. But because she was so violently taken from us, that person didn't let her grow to see the true beauty of who she was going to become as a young woman, as a grandma. And us, the world, what we lost because we couldn't share with her and her talents and her vision for the world. And that time was so desperately pain-striking to our community that I felt, and the community felt, that we had no comfort, and to look at each other and to look within. And for myself, that's my grandmother's teaching, the foundation, the bedrock of who we are. And so I remember as a young child always going to my grandma, kind of hooking into her hip, and any grandmas in the room knows what that feels like. And pressing my body into her hip and smelling the wood, smelling the onion, the potato, and knowing that that was my safe space. And so for my community, and as we were all dealing with this tragedy, then I know grandma back home, we call it Masana scarf. And so every day I wear this scarf where it recognizes all of Ashlyn's colors, the blossoming of the flowers, but it's also Masana's scarf, that strength, that willingness to stand firm. And so when we look at this information and this data, that's what it takes. And so it's pulling us beyond what we're comfortable with and looking this issue square in the eye. And so we created the Sexual Assault Prevention Subcommittee. And this was really the first time as a council, as a nation, that we started looking at what violence was happening in our communities, and then how we were responsible as tribal leadership to help and support these courageous conversations that were happening. Not to say, oh, poor thing, but what's next? No, to stay in that pain, to sit in that pain. And as we continued, we did many amazing things in terms of initiatives and looking at what was happening for sexual assault prevention. And then in those conversations, finding out that we had missing relatives for many, many years. When we were announcing on the radio Ashland's funeral, I got passed a note, and it asked the community if they've seen this woman. She has brown hair. She's in her late 50s. She was last seen walking on Main and Butler. And if anybody has any information, call the radio station. And so I made the announcement, and I asked the announcer, Shaman, give me more information. This sounds, let me know what's happening. She said, this is my daughter, and we're looking for her. And thank you for giving the announcement, because people hearing your voice, maybe if someone saw something, they'll report it. So I asked her a few more questions. Is there a police report? Is there a flyer? What else can we do? She said, every day for 20 years, I've been waiting for my daughter to come home. And so I thought to myself, if after 20 years there was no police report, there was no flyer, it was just this one mother and her family trying to find her, there has to be a better way. And so we started working with the missing and murdered and their relatives. And so things started coming together after we testified at the U.S. Senate on Indian Affairs in December of 2018. Because still at that time, December 2018, our federal partners still didn't think there was a problem. They testified before the Senate committee, the head of the FBI. There is enough agents on the ground in Indian country. There is not an issue with missing persons. And it wasn't until the Urban Indian Institute, based out of Seattle, provided that groundbreaking report from Sovereign Bodies Institute, that people really started seeing that there was data, and that we were not going to give up, and we were not going to be silenced, that we were going to tell their stories. And so we came together, and as Navajo Nation, we started looking for partnerships and a way for us to understand what's happening on the ground. And if our federal partners want data, then is it necessary to go door by door, community by community? And so this is a timeline of what we did. Can y'all still hear me? Okay. Sorry. I have a theory that technology really doesn't like me, but that's a battle that we'll battle it out. And so we started holding key meetings, and what's important for us is because we all sometimes are driven by data, and data has to tell a story, but how do you create data that doesn't reflect what we're seeing on the ground? So we started pulling what we could, and we started seeing these huge disparities that were unknown to us on Navajo, unknown to me as a mother, unknown to me really as a delegate. Because today, I can't tell you how many Navajos are missing. That's an injustice. And so what we found was that on average, Navajo Nation, we get about 200,000 emergency calls. And half of those are dealing and relating with some violence. And in Indian country, if not most dangerous call for any of our law enforcement is a call on domestic violence. We've lost officers on the line, and just recently, a few days ago, we lost an officer at White Mountain Apache on a call regarding some form of domestic violence. And so on Navajo, we have about 230 police officers. And so I don't understand data, and I don't know what 0.85 of a person looks like, but that's all we have for 1,000 people. And so why is that important for us to figure that out? Because on average, a national average, when we start talking to leadership, if you're from the East Coast, if you're from a metro area, an urban area, you're looking at anywhere from 16 to 24 officers per 1,000 people. So what does this create? This creates this kind of dynamic in the community that even though if they're going to call someone, cross your fingers if someone's going to respond. And this creates a distrust in the community. And I think as medical providers on the ground, the first thing you need is trust. So when people ask me, why isn't that person in the database? We're finding families that simply will not report because they've been shamed and blamed out of that police department. And so I think what also is important, and then Shadeja, I'm gonna let you help me get through some of this data, is the type of violence that we're seeing in our communities, and the type of violence that you may be practicing medicine or providing service in. And so the type of violence that we're seeing is not only do we have about 40 homicides every year on Navajo Nation, but when you start comparing that to our data, that's 4 times the national average. So if you're listening to national news and you hear about cities like Chicago and their homicide rates, that's above what we're seeing in terms of when we start comparing the data per population and what our communities are dealing with on the ground. Other data that we have to start looking at is how many assaults are happening, how many rapes are happening on Navajo Nation. And so we have 110 chapter community areas, but to have 160 rapes reported, and I know as medical providers, we know not every rape, first of all, is reported. What we're stressing, if anything, please get your medical attention that you need so that we can help with the healing and the restoration as we deal with some of this unjust criminal justice system that's considered on Navajo and Indian country. And the reason why I'm so aggressive mama bear about it, because when the FBI testified in DC, they didn't even have the decency to stay in the room to hear the testimony from the Native Nations on what we were seeing from on the ground. And so I will continue to keep them accountable and keep their feet to the fire, because of all of the federal laws that we discuss, it is their job to keep us safe. And yet, time and time, they have failed that duty. So should these come on up and help me with the presentation to talk about what we've seen from our community-based partners. And again, if you need time, breathe. I'm telling myself, breathe. I love that fan back there. Next time I'm going to bring a fan because it's not on fire.
So just a quick brief introduction of myself. She Julian Holgate, she Kazashan and Schnack the Lok at the Abashishi, Hashkan, so how does she change the Turji National? Shatwadan Isinasha. My name is Jolene Holgate. I am helping my older sister lead this project, and I am originally from Shanto, but I currently reside in Flagstaff, so I do a lot of traveling to make sure that we're a part of these spaces and that we're also projecting our voice and creating that awareness and hopefully, inspiring some of our other relatives. So going back to the data information that we collected, When we started working with partners such as the Sovereign Bodies Institute and the Navajo Nation Missing Persons Updates, we realized that there was definitely a contrast in the data that was being collected at the top level, I guess you could say, which is FBI, Navajo PD, CI, and then the contrasting with our community-based organizations, our boots on the ground, the people that are having this actual FaceTime with the people and their stories. So as far as the Navajo Nation, we do have about 164 missing persons cases starting from 1951, and those are just cases that are actually on record or recorded. This number definitely fluctuates. I know our sister Mesky, who is the creator and the volunteer advocate for Navajo Nation Missing Persons Updates, told me that just in the recent month she gained 10 more cases. So based on if cases are closed or cases are open, that number does fluctuate. The picture that we're seeing out on Navajo is a very interesting dynamic as it compares to the national NMIW conversation. 70% of our missing relatives are male. That is our men and boys. That is, that may include our unsheltered relatives. And 30% of those cases are female. However, of course, on the opposite end of the spectrum, we do have the violent perpetrations, the higher murder rates are affecting our female relatives on Navajo. 38% of the cases are missing persons cases and 62% are murder cases. And this information is a bit more self-explanatory. And also to give you an idea of where these cases are occurring, 41% of those cases are on the Navajo Nation, 10% are in the rural off-reservation areas, and 49% in urban communities, such as Albuquerque. I know the Urban Indian Health Institute released a very strong report regarding MMIW, I believe last year, and I know Albuquerque was one of those hot spots, so we definitely do have a large percentage of our missing Navajo relatives, as well as the Gallup area. And it was really interesting to see Gallup, I think, one or two as one of the communities in terms of New Mexico missing relatives, just considering that Gallup is not that large of a, I don't even know if you'd even call that an urban area, but that would be where a lot of the other cases are occurring. So this kind of paints a portrait of what the dynamic of these cases are. 22% of the cases are involving our young girls under the age of 18. And I think another important point to bring up is this also does directly link to sex trafficking. I know the average age for Indigenous young girls age of being trafficked is around 14 years old. So we're starting to see that same trend within Navajo. Our young girls are being preyed upon through social media. We have single mothers who are being preyed upon in the border town areas. I know Delegate Crowley has some firsthand experience of stories that she's received from community members. So we're also trying to take a look at what that picture really looks like on Navajo. Although there is no or little data on our LGBTQIA2S relatives, we do want to stress that they are a very important part of this conversation. And I would encourage not just our health providers, but as well as other community organizations to also involve those relatives to begin understanding what that picture looks like. How can you shape those services to serve our two-spirited relatives and our trans relatives? So I will leave this up to Delegate Crotty. She's a wordsmith. I'm the nerd, so.
I always say I'm a recovery nerd. Before I was a delegate, my work was in policy work at Dinek College, and so we use Dinek concepts, our own concepts on how to look at policy. And so this is a part where it's not a term used a lot in our communities. So maybe here in a professional setting, we're learning more about intergenerational trauma. This is always a part where I tell myself, take a breath, check in on your audience, check in on yourself. And what we're looking at at is we're trying to understand how intergenerational trauma plays out in our communities. And what I tell our community members is when grandma was pregnant with your mother, you were also in her womb because your mother's ovaries were there, right? Little babies. And so I have a nice little visual, again, I'm still saying I'm not a boomer, but I'll get it in there. And so what we're saying is you, us, me, were in grandma's body, feeling that life flow, feeling that breath, feeling those experiences, and that has a chain of events. And so as our practitioners have taught us in terms of that healing aspect, sometimes having to go back to that. Because what our communities now are also suffering are being on high alert with anxiety, and then I'm coming into the community and telling them there's more that you need to know. And so what we're trying to let them know is there's ways, right? There's ways that we can figure out what that anxiety looks like and how to conquer some of that fear. And so we do a lot of tapping. Does anybody do tapping in the room? I love you guys. When I found out that you can do tapping, my life became beautiful. Because I'm also a strong advocate. For Navajo, we don't really do needles, so like acupuncture is not really a thing, but we're also now bringing in acu-talks. And so sometimes I'll be in my community, and they're like, you got stuff in your ear. And I said, yes, those are my healing seeds. And so talking to grandma about how there's areas where we can have control over that anxiety. And so we talk about intergenerational trauma. And the reason why we bring it up in this conversation, and I think for the purpose of this presentation, is not so much, we usually start going over some of the cases for some community prevention, but I think what we really want to focus in here is just getting the word out of what we're doing, what we're seeing on the ground, and how we're caring for the community. Because a lot of times they won't see justice in the courtroom. We know that by our federal partners declining cases, not prosecuting, not referring cases, and so a lot of that is out of our hands. And so we still see these perpetrators in our communities. And so we want them to know more about intergenerational trauma. And most importantly, this last paragraph is we don't want when people close their eyes and think about perpetrators or think about people who are going to inflict harm as just men. And our men are feeling that burden. So we could talk about colonialism, we could talk about patriarchy, we could talk about settler colonialism, but at the end of the day, if our men feel that they are constantly being targeted as the abusers, as the attackers, as the perpetrators, then we're not able to look within us and see that person's trauma that they're trying to deal with. And so one of our forums specifically looked at the Navajo male experience. Because it wasn't until we started talking to volunteers on the ground that we even noticed that it was our men who were missing at 70%. And so how are we going to change our approach to include them in the conversation as our husbands, as our brothers, as our fathers, as our grandfathers, and not just as him over there. And so that's one of the things that we have to discuss in the community so that we're not in this victim stage, but moving on and empowering ourselves, because collectively, and in this room, we have the solution. And collectively, in the communities that I represent and the Navajo Nation, they have the solutions. But there was a point where that was taken away from them. And so we're trying to rebuild them and reconnect onto what we already know. I could say, yes, I graduated from a top university, but sometimes I want my money back. Because grandma already knew that. Right? Yes. Clap for that. I paid Sally Mae so she could leave. so I want to say in terms of time, we have about 10 more minutes. And so we do have some cases, and I'm not going to go too much into them, but all of them have, with permission from the families, because as families who have not been served justice are working with us to do prevention work, awareness, keep their story alive. And so all of you, as you journey with us, we see you as the next set of advocates to keep this story alive. Because all of these women need to have that full investigation. Right.
The big button.
And so Ariel's case has touched a lot of our lives, and Miski talked about her earlier. And what's important for me to shed light on is Ariel, prior to her abduction, she was a victim of a severe domestic violence that had led her in our communities. When you're at a certain stage of trauma, then you're flown out. And so her attack was so severe that she was flown out, but she was actively participating in her case against her abuser. And so what Jacqueline, her mother, cannot get over is her boyfriend picked her up, and that was the last time anybody saw her until we found parts of her remains. And so Jacqueline continued to not only advocate for her daughter, but for all of the missing on Navajo. And ultimately, with the stress and her already existing medical conditions, 3 months later, we lost Jacqueline. And so Ariel's sister is now left without a sister in her home, without a mother in her home. And now, in the work that we do, we heard the devastating news that FBI now has placed her case as a cold case. So no further investigation. But it's hard for us to sit with that, knowing what happened to her, how she was trying to bring justice, and then ultimately what happened in her last days of here with us. And so Ariel's case is ongoing, and it's actually a case that we want to refer to this special FBI unit that's going to start reviewing some of these missing and murdered cold cases. Working with Amanda's family, this show demonstrates when our community members, because there's a shortage of economic opportunities back home, or wage economy systems don't work out, and so we have a lot of community members that have to travel for jobs. And so Amanda was one of a traveling construction worker. It's important for her family, and it's important for me to state that she was married and a mother of 3. Because while she was out traveling at one of her work sites in Kentucky, she met a gentleman for the first time, to our knowledge, who was mentally unstable. His family had reported him many times. And through this altercation, he violently stabbed Amanda to death. And so when we talk about victim blaming, victim shaming, some of the questions that came up: first, we were never notified as a nation that one of our women was killed in another state. And then second, the victim blaming of why was she there, what was she up to. And so we reiterate, she was a mother of 3 working for her family. And we know that Mr. James is going to be sentenced soon, but for her family, that doesn't bring her back. And so they're still in the depths of sorrow and grieving, and we're thankful that they have worked with us and have been part of the solution in bringing in trail rides, bringing in horses as a way of healing, empowering the community, and making sure that this does not happen to another young Navajo family. Case 3, and here in Albuquerque, we had 3 Navajo women who identified as transgender. All were reported missing. One of the cases, we were able to get enough evidence to prosecute and get a sentence. The other 2 cases are still still what we call cold cases. And so there's some issues in terms of how we look at these murders, how law enforcement work with the families, and then what's going to happen when we refer these cases to the FBI special unit. And so case 4 is one of my more challenging stories is with Grandma Holiday, who was home, and because of a land dispute over a grazing area, her neighbor not only shot her, but then and killed her, murdered her, but then tied her up and placed her body where it was difficult to find. And so when we found her, for us, this demonstrates when we talk about who are the victims of violence, there's no across the spectrum is what we're seeing. And so we know that this case is, he'll serve many years in jail, but to think about her children and her grandchildren who know the violence that happened in their house and in their community, and what we're doing to do our prevention work, and how long it takes for law enforcement to respond, and what type of care is given to the family for long-term grief. Often these families feel isolated, they don't think it's happened to anybody else, and so nobody's really connecting and sharing with them their stories. And so that's a lot of the work that Jolene and I do working with Miski, is to make sure that families know that they're not alone, that this happens to all of us. And when we lose one relative, we all, that plays a part in all of us in this world. And so we've done community forums. It's always a challenge to work at the community level, but we went to Shiprock, we went then west to Flagstaff, and then we headed down to Gallup, and then we went up to Tuba City, and our next stop at the end of March is going to be the southern part of Utah. Because Utah, we're seeing some severe issues with jurisdiction, and ultimately who is going to be accountable to the families. And so we do have action teams for the policy nerds in here. We do want to control our own data into our own story and respect families that do not want this information shared with federal partners or government officials. There are some families that just do not want someone else to know their story. And so we'll continue to work on our Data Institute. We all know accessing data, putting in numbers at the end of the day is tiresome, but as an Nation, we want to know what's happening on the ground, and we want to have an idea of how all the federal partners are working together, state partners, and our own tribal programs. So we're creating strategies to combat violence, and we're really raising awareness through social media campaigns, presentations like this, and so we'll continue to work with Navajo Department of Public Safety. We still do not have a program on Navajo that house our missing families. We still do not have a missing persons unit in our police department. And it is something that we have tried the last 3 years to move these initiatives beyond promises to really initiate and enact and to fully fund. And so we decided as a group working with the families, at least we could create a community toolkit. So, and working with our medical providers, some screening, understanding the different ways of when an individual is missing, because often there's a medical record history to look at. There's other things that help us try to figure out what happened to them in their last days and where we can continue our investigation. And so we're looking, and that's why I talk a lot about self-care. I did not want to know anything about self-care. I thought I say my prayer, I go to ceremony, I offer want to pierce this armor I've built up for myself. Because sometimes the pain is just unimaginable. And what we felt when Ashton was taken, I do not want to feel that again. But I do now know that self-care has led me to an authentic healing journey. And so for all of the practitioners in the room that advocate for that, be kind to yourself, talk to yourself, and I talk to myself all the time. And I tell myself, tell the story, be courageous, because that family does not have this mic. And so I want to thank the organizers for allowing me to be here. We talk a lot about taking care of yourself. Be the eyes. If you see some suspicious activity, I always say, can I help you? Where's your mom? And we do it across the board. And so for all of you in the room, that's what we want to leave with. We have different developments that are happening. Here's some information. Again, we're on Facebook. We're not Twitter or IG. But if you could play the last video, you could please just, it's about 3.5 minutes, and then we'll end in a good way.
Is this working? I have one more thing to mention real quick.
Well, he's queuing up.
Okay.
So we just launched our website, and we do have our website URL here. It's currently still in the process of being updated, but I know for this presentation, one of the objectives that we also wanted to center on is how we organized, and I think it's really important for not only just healthcare providers, but any type of direct service providers that are helping these families of missing and murdered relatives to also work with the community organizations who are not only engaged in this work, but that actually have face time with the families. We're definitely a resource if you ever need us. So our information is here, so feel free to reach out to us if you need that.
I forgot about your objectives. This was a hard conference to present at.
In cities like Detroit or San Diego, how is that possible? That's possible because we have systemic failure in how we report crimes, how people feel protected, how sexual violence has been normalized, and how sexual violence was used in the past to displace us from the land. We're here still on the ground just trying to get basic services like police officers, broadband service. If we could get 911 on Navajo Nation, we would be doing something spectacular. We're literally in the dark when it comes to telecommunication, when it comes to emergency response. We have one shelter here, and it can only house 8 people. I sit on the Navajo Nation Council here in Winter Rock, Arizona. My family originates from the Chute Springs area along the Chichikai Mountain, where we have been for many generations. So my family story and the story of myself is like so many Navajos. A story of being forced away from the land, a story of forced removal of our grandparents into the school system. That means dealing with intergenerational trauma, knowing that my grandmas who returned from the long walk, the pain and the sorrow of losing their home, their relatives, their animals, and then coming back and rebuilding and using our land, using our prayers, using our ceremonies to continue that strength. They put literal prayers in the ground for us, for me, for my children, to know that we would come back home, to know that I would be standing here one day in the leadership position, helping my people. As a Navajo woman, I can talk about topics that our Navajo men or leaders have not feel comfortable talking about, allowing me to tell my story on the floor of not only my experience being groped by an elected official while I was a political staffer, but to tell the story of what's going on in our community. That's a story of families that are steeped in violence, using alcohol and drugs to numb their pain. It's boys who were molested and traumatized who are now men who are in silence because they're vulnerable. Individuals at every single level have been touched by this. Family members, community members, professionals have told me that they have been either a victim of violence, sexually assaulted, a survivor. The crisis of violence against Navajo women. We're just at the tip of the iceberg. We have to change that norm, that me hearing young girls saying, not if it's going to happen when we do our prevention work, but what do I do when it happens? My name is Amber Canis Macrati, and this is my brief but spectacular take on revitalizing Navajo community.